I'm pleased to have this chance to introduce smart thinking to you. Now, when you think about smart thinking for the first time, you might start thinking about intelligence and the kinds of things that IQ tests measure. But if you really think carefully about IQ tests, it turns out that they explain only a small part of ultimately how smart and how successful you can be in solving problems. After all, we all know people who score very well on intelligence tests, but they don't seem to succeed very well in life. And we know other people whose test scores probably aren't that high, and yet they go on to achieve great things. Now, there is some effect of these intelligence tests of IQ on how well you're going to be able to think, but most of it has to do more with the things that you pick up over the course of your life, with the knowledge that you acquire, and with your ability to use that knowledge. And as a result, what I've done in smart thinking is to try to distill your ability to be smart and successful, and to distill that down to 3 parts. So the formula for smart thinking is first to develop smart habits, and then to use those smart habits to help you acquire high quality knowledge, and then third, to be able to use that knowledge when you need it. Now, the nice thing about this formula is that all 3 parts of it, developing habits, acquiring knowledge, and being able to use that knowledge when you need it, all of those things are things that are under your control, which means that you can learn to develop your habits more effectively because much of your life is controlled by habits. You can be more effective at learning, and at learning the right kinds of knowledge, which, as we'll see, is what we'll call causal knowledge, or the answer to the question why. And finally, you can learn ways of describing the problems that you solve in ways that will help you to bring new knowledge to your mind whenever it is that you get stuck. And so the happy thing is that while you might have some natural intelligence that might differ from that of the people around you, what really is going to guide how smart you can be is your ability to use this formula and to develop those skills to help you think more effectively. A key part of the formula for smart thinking is developing smart habits. Now, the thing about smart habits is that what you're trying to do is to turn the things that you do on a daily basis into mindless things. Now, it turns out that your mind is a habit creation machine. What you are designed to do is to compile away, to put away all of the things that you do regularly so that you don't have to think about them. Imagine when you wake up in the morning in your home, you know all of your routines in the morning. You can get up, you can get out of bed, you can get yourself ready for the day, you can have your breakfast, and you can do all of that without thinking. But now imagine doing the same thing going to another country. Now, even getting out of bed, you have to think, where am I? Where did I put all of my things? Where is the shower? How do I find what it is that I'm going to do? And so in those situations, you can't rely on your habits, and that helps you to realize how much of your life really is driven by these habits. It turns out that habits in general are often very smart because you have only a limited amount of ability to think carefully. And so you don't want to spend that time and that effort thinking about the things that you do routinely. Instead, you want to be able to focus your efforts on the things that really require careful thought. So generally speaking, habits are a great idea. Now, how do you create a habit? Habits get created whenever there are 2 things. One is what's called a consistent mapping, and the other is repetition. A consistent mapping means that there is some consistent relationship between what's happening in the world and your behavior. Think about driving in a car. Whenever you drive in the car, the gas pedal and the brake pedal are always in the same place. And as a result, after driving numerous times, you can press the gas pedal, you can press the brake pedal without ever having to think about it. If you had to think about it all the time, then that would cause a real problem when you get stuck in traffic. When there's a car that stops suddenly in front of you, you want to be able to press that brake pedal without having to think about it. And so habits end up being a very good thing. And the way that that habit gets created is that not only is there consistent mapping, but you do it over and over and over again. Now that's a very simple example that doesn't seem so smart. But now let's think about other things. In order to do complicated math, for example, you have to turn all of your basic math facts into routines. You don't want to have to think about what it is that 3 plus 5 equals, or that 3 times 5 equals. You want to be able to have those answers immediately when you need them. And so having those kinds of facts as habits turns out to be really important. In addition, we're going to talk about the variety of ways that people acquire knowledge. You want to turn those studies into habits as well. You want to be able to learn effectively by habit, which means you may need to change your environment in order to learn more effectively, because in many ways we have habits that end up getting in the way of our smart thinking. So for example, if you sit down in an office building, chances are you have a nice computer screen in front of you. And on that computer screen, you're able to open up all kinds of beautiful windows. You've got your email window, you've got your instant messaging window, you've got a variety of documents open, you've got the internet, and the world is at your fingertips. The problem is that when the world is at your fingertips like that, you develop habits to check your email every time it comes in. In fact, lots of people end up with the habit of checking their email every 5 or 10 minutes, whether they think they have a new one or not. And if the phone rings, you have the habit of picking that up. And if an instant message comes in, you have the habit of answering that right away. And all of those habits end up getting in the way of doing things effectively. We think we're being efficient by answering emails as soon as they come in. But you know what? Every once in a while, people can wait to hear back from you, particularly when that habit gets in the way of learning effectively. And so instead, what we want to do is to find ways to change your environment so that you change the habits that you have in order to be able to learn effectively. And one of those things that you can do, for example, is to close down your email. There should be at least an hour a day where your email just isn't available to you. And if you can't shut it off of your computer, then physically get up and bring something with you, a book that you're reading or something else, and take it into another room, away from your email, away from your instant messages. Keep your smartphone somewhere else, and really sit down and give yourself the time and the space that you need to learn effectively. And if you do that, then you're really on the road to developing smart habits and not letting the habits that you've already developed control the way that you think. Now, a lot of people ask, how long does it take to create a habit? The answer to that question is that it really depends on the environment that you're in. If the environment that you're in is very distinctive, then it's very easy to create a habit. You can create a habit, for example, if you're trying to find your route home from work. And let's imagine you leave your office building and you're going to get on a subway. The first time that you do it, you have to check all of the signs in order to figure out where you are, and then to figure out where to buy a ticket and how to get on the subway. And then you have to pay careful attention to figure out where to get off. But after a while, you can do these things by routine. Now, some of those aspects are going to be very easy to do by routine. So the subway station where you get on is probably very distinctive. And after even 3 or 4 times of getting on it, you'll know this is the place where you go, and this is where you walk, and this is how you get onto the subway at that place. And so you won't need a lot of repetition in order to be able to effectively get home from work. But once you're on the subway, every subway car looks the same from the inside. It's a little box crowded with people. And so it's very hard to know exactly where to get off the subway by routine. You'll get a feel for how long you should be on it, but it's going to take many, many, many repetitions of that before you feel confident that you can do that without having to think carefully about it. And as a result, that environment, because it's not distinctive, takes a much longer time to develop a habit. So a few repetitions are necessary when there's something very distinctive you're trying to do, and a lot of repetitions are needed when things aren't distinctive. Now, what that means for your work environment is that if you have habits that you want to create, one of the things that you want to do is to make sure that you create a distinctive environment. find ways of setting up your desk. Find ways of setting up the space around you so that they are distinct, so that they are different from other places where you spend your time, so that you can quickly develop habits that work for you effectively in that work environment. And you should try to set up all of your different workspaces in the same way. So if you have an office at work and you have an office at home, you should try to set things up so that things are in the same place when they're at home and when they're at work. Even down to the level of where you might find a dispenser for tape or some notepads. All of those should be in the same place so that you can reach to the same places with those without having to think about it. After all, you don't want to disrupt your chain of thought by having to think about where it is that you want to throw away a piece of paper. You'd like all of those things to be mindless, because it turns out that part of being smart is knowing when things should be mindless and when things should be mindful. And when we talk about acquiring high-quality knowledge, when we talk about using that knowledge when you need it, those are things that need to be mindful. And everything else needs to be mindless. Everything else needs to be the sort of thing that you can do without having to think about it. Now, one of the key aspects of smart thinking is that you have to make sure that you review whatever it is that you've just learned. So let me take a second to review what we've talked about with smart habits. If you want to have smart habits, you have to create a consistent mapping between the world and a behavior. You need to repeat that. It's going to take more time to learn a habit when that habit isn't distinctive than when that habit is a distinctive thing. And finally, you want to take those things that you do repeatedly that really shouldn't require thought and try and turn those into habits so that you can focus your energy on learning and you can focus your energy on using your knowledge when you need it. So another key part of the formula for smart thinking is the development of high-quality knowledge. Now, what exactly does this mean? In order to really think about this carefully, we need to take a step back for a second and think about the word smart for a moment. Most people, when they hear the word smart, they start by thinking about some idea about intelligence. They assume that if you are smart, that part of what makes you smart is that you have this quality of intelligence, and this quality of intelligence is the thing that gets measured in all kinds of tests, in intelligence tests, in SAT tests to get into college, in GRE tests to get into graduate school. But the fact is that if you really look carefully, those scores on those tests often don't really predict much about people's future success. If you look around, we all know people who scored very well on an SAT or claim to have gotten a great IQ test score, and yet they don't seem to be very successful. And we know other people who are extraordinarily successful, and yet when you look at these test scores, they don't seem to have done much better than anyone else does. And the reason for that is because very little about smart thinking actually has to do with the scores that you get on these kinds of tests. Instead, what really drives your ability to be smart is how much you know and your ability to use it when you need it. I mean, if you don't believe that, if you're really skeptical, is this really the way things work, let's try a different domain for a second. Think about being able to play a musical instrument. Do you really think that you'd be able to play a musical instrument just because you're smart? Of course not. Anyone who's successful in playing a musical instrument has spent a lot of time practicing and a lot of time learning about music. That's clearly what makes somebody able to play an instrument. Well, the same thing is true in anything else. The same thing is true in sports. You don't shoot a good free throw just because you're smart. And it's also true that just because you've scored well on an intelligence test doesn't mean that you're going to be able to do things successfully that require thinking. Thinking is just as much a skill as learning to play a musical instrument or learning to shoot a free throw. That's why knowledge is so crucial, because knowledge is the thing that you pick up in the process of learning. But it isn't just any knowledge that you need. The knowledge that you really need is what we're going to call high-quality knowledge. High quality knowledge is the knowledge about the way the world works, what we sometimes call causal knowledge. The way that you know you're dealing with causal knowledge is because that's the knowledge you need to answer the question, why? Now, human beings love to answer the question, why? And we love to ask the question, why? Anyone who's ever spent any time at all with a 5-year-old child knows that a 5-year-old child's favorite question is why. They see something and immediately they want to know why. And as a parent or other adult, you end up trying to explain it to them. And then what do? They ask why again. And they ask why and why. And after a while, you often find that you can't answer them anymore, which gets a little bit frustrating. And that's going to be important. We're going to talk about that in a second. But that kind of why knowledge is important because that's the knowledge that allows you to answer a new question. Think about this. I think I'm a fairly smart person, and I think I've been fairly successful. And yet I have no idea at all how my car works. All I know is that with the car I have now, I have to put something in the dashboard and press a button. And when I press a button, that car had better start. Because if it doesn't, I don't know what to do. And at that point, I need to bring my car to the mechanic. The mechanic is able to fix my car in a way that I can't because my mechanic understands why my car works. And so the mechanic hears the sounds that the car's making, or if it didn't turn on, hears that it's not making any sound at all, and is able to look at what's going on, diagnose the problem based on knowledge about the way the car works, and then to fix it. So in that instance, that mechanic is far smarter than I am because the mechanic is able to do something that I can't because the mechanic has high quality knowledge about the way that my car works. In general, we need to figure out the way things work in the world. Unfortunately, we don't always have knowledge that is as good as we think it is. There were studies that were done at Yale University suggesting that people suffer from something called an illusion of explanatory depth. Now that's a big word. Let me unpack this a little bit. Illusion, that means that you see something that isn't really there. An explanatory depth, the ability to create a good or deep explanation. Now this illusion is that we often believe that we know more than we think we do about the way that the world works. And what they did in these studies was very simple. They would just show people a bunch of common household objects like a coffee maker or a toilet, and they would say, do you know how this works? And they would wait until people would say confidently, yes, I know how that works. I know that I could explain that. And when they found items that people thought they could explain, then they would say, okay, explain it to me. And it turned out that people were less able to explain things than they thought they were going to be able to be. Now, you may not believe this. I know I didn't believe this when I first saw it. I was convinced that I could do this and that it had something to do with the fact that they were just testing a bunch of college students. And yet, I then tried it for myself. So what I did was I decided to explain how a toilet works. Because starting at the age of 5, I would always like to look at a toilet, take the top off the tank and look inside of it. And it turned out that, and I was sure that I was going to know how to explain this. And so I started trying to do it. So I said, look, what you do is you press the handle on the toilet, and that handle is connected to a chain. That chain pulls up a little valve at the bottom of the tank. And then the water starts to flow out of the tank. And when all of the water goes away, the valve closes for some reason. And then the water begins to fill the tank. And there's a little ball in the tank. And when the water reaches the level of the ball, then it closes a switch, and that makes the water stop going. And then the water that went out of the tank goes somewhere, and when it gets to the bottom of the bowl, it somehow got into the bowl, and we're not quite sure how that happened. And then most of the water carries away what was in the bowl, but some of the water stays. That's not a very good explanation, is it? So I realized when I myself tried to explain these things that actually I had no idea how many of the aspects of a toilet worked. And yet I thought, I was convinced that I understood. Now in the case of a toilet, maybe it isn't so important that I understand the way it works. But if I don't understand how the toilet works, and I was sure I understood it, how many other things are there that I thought I understood, and yet I really don't? And that is a crucial thing that we need to be able to address. We need to be able to get better at having high quality knowledge. Now you might ask, why exactly do we need this knowledge? Well, here's the reason. Let's take the example of James Dyson. James Dyson was vacuuming in the 1970s, and he noticed as he vacuumed that the vacuum cleaner would lose suction as it went along. And as a result, it would stop picking up dirt as effectively. Now most people, when they encounter this problem, they just empty the bag. And a few people who are interested in inventing something might try and create a better bag for a vacuum. But Dyson actually thought about it, and he realized that the problem that a vacuum cleaner is trying to solve is that it takes in a bunch of dirt and air that gets sucked into it, and then it needs to find a way of separating the dirt from the air. Now here's where the high quality knowledge comes in. Dyson was a person who liked to spend time understanding the way things worked in the world. And he had once toured a sawmill and learned that when you have a sawmill, you take big logs and you cut them down into boards. And when you cut them down into boards, it generates a tremendous amount of sawdust. That sawdust needs to be sucked out of the sawmill so that it doesn't clog up the machinery. And so there's essentially a giant vacuum cleaner that's pulling the sawdust out of the sawmill. Now, that vacuum doesn't have a gigantic vacuum cleaner bag on it. Instead, what it uses is something called an industrial cyclone, which is basically a device that's cone-shaped, and the air comes in and it creates a cyclone, a swirling column of air. That column of air throws the sawdust to the sides of the cone, and then the sawdust sinks down in the cone and into a receptacle where it can be taken away later. No bag. Now, when Dyson encountered the sawmill, he couldn't possibly have known that at some time in the future he was going to need to know that in order to be able to do something else with it. And yet, when he encountered the problem with the vacuum, he realized he could use that industrial sawmill, that same idea, to create a miniature industrial cyclone inside a vacuum cleaner and then get rid of having a bag altogether. And that's what he did. He spent some time devising a small industrial cyclone inside a vacuum cleaner and created a business that generates hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue each year. The key point to this is Dyson did two things that were very smart. The first is he learned about things that he didn't know he was going to need at the time that he learned them. And the second thing that he did that was really important is that he made sure that he understood them so that he could use that knowledge later effectively. So he had high quality knowledge. Because that's the issue with being smart. The key to being smart is having knowledge that you're going to be able to use later, even though at the time that you learn that information, you're not sure that you're going to need it. So that's what high quality knowledge is. How can we make sure then that we don't suffer from the illusion of explanatory depth? Well, one of the ways that you can do that is by taking a lesson from teaching. If you've ever had to teach something to someone else before, one of the things that you discover is that when you teach, you have to learn everything far better than you learned it when you first encountered the information. Because when you teach something to someone else, you discover all of the aspects of it that you don't understand as well as you thought you did. I'm a professor at a university, and I train graduate students all the time. One of the things that I tell graduate students when they go off to take their first jobs as professors at other schools is that when they teach a class for the first time, it's going to take them about 7 hours to prepare each 1 hour lecture that they give. Now, why would it take 7 hours to prepare something that's only going to take an hour to give? The reason it takes so long is that in the process of developing that 1 hour lecture, you discover all of these things that you don't understand nearly as well as you thought you did, and you end up having to go back and look up that information to make sure you really understand it before you have to step in front of a classroom. What does that mean for you? What that means is that you need to get in the habit of teaching. Now, you may not have an audience of students ready to take a class from you, but that doesn't matter. You can teach yourself. So this is what's called self-explanation. When you learn something new, rather than just pretending that you understand it or believing that you understand it, you need to take the time to teach it to yourself. And as part of the process of teaching it to yourself, what you're doing is really generating an explanation. And what that does is to show you all of the places where that explanation doesn't work so well. You're going to find all of the places where you don't understand things. You're going to find all of the places where you have gaps in your knowledge. And you're going to find all of the places where there are words that you thought you understood and you really don't understand. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. After I discovered that I had no idea how a flush toilet worked, one of the things that I did was to go read some explanations about it. Not that I knew when I'd ever need this knowledge, but I figured it was worth trying to learn that. Now, it turns out that the reason why the water in a toilet goes out, but not all of it goes out, is that at the very base of a toilet, there's a pipe that goes down, and then up again, and then down. And the reason that it's shaped like that is that it creates what's called a siphon. And it pulls out most of what's in the toilet, but the amount of water that stays in it, it rises to about the height of this little loop in the pipe. So I thought, great, now I understand how the toilet works. Only then as I thought about it more, I realized I'm not actually sure what a siphon does. I've seen siphons before, and I've used them to try and drain things out of areas of a house that was flooding, but I didn't really understand how it worked. And I actually ended up having to go back and learn more about the way siphons work. What this means is that for many of us, there may be words like that that we use, and the words themselves can also give us this illusion of explanatory depth. And so we have to be careful both when we're teaching ourselves things to figure out how is it that we can avoid the gaps in our knowledge and how can we fill those gaps, and also can we find gaps that are caused by words that are part of our explanations that we don't really understand. So those are critical parts of developing high quality knowledge. Now, one of the things that this really suggests is that learning is hard. One of the things that we don't appreciate, I think, is that the process of thinking is often very easy. That is, when you're having a great conversation with someone, when you're trying to brainstorm ideas with people, that often feels very good. The difficult part of thinking is actually learning, because that's the place where you have to grapple with information that you don't yet understand. And that's where smart habits come in. Because one of the things that you need to do is to create an environment that allows you to learn effectively, even in situations in which it's difficult. Because whenever you've encountered difficult learning, chances are you'd rather be doing almost anything else. If you're trying to pore over something difficult at work, you'd probably rather be checking your email or answering a phone call rather than having to struggle through learning and developing this high quality knowledge. So what you want to do is to make sure that in those situations in which you have to explain things to yourself and fill in the gaps in your knowledge, that what you're going to do is to create a work environment that is as free from distractions as possible. You want to make sure that you are not tempted to answer your emails, to answer your text messages, to make phone calls, and to do other things that in the moment will feel a lot more fun. Because even though they feel more fun in the moment, they're not actually helping you to develop high quality knowledge, because learning is difficult. This also means that we need to help people develop good habits for learning this high quality knowledge from an early age. We live in a world now with smartphones, with portable computers that are constantly connected to the internet. And that means that from the age of 7 or 8 years old, kids are being surrounded by the same kinds of temptations that we're seeing in the work environment. And that means that kids are being tempted away from developing high quality knowledge at an earlier age than we were, or certainly than I was, when I didn't have a laptop computer and a smartphone. And so what we need to do is to help by protecting kids' environments in the study room. We need to park the technology at the door. And if kids are going to be using a computer as part of their homework, we need to really be monitoring the way that the internet is being used to make sure that it's being used to help fill in gaps in knowledge rather than as an escape from the hard work of learning and acquiring high quality knowledge. Because that ultimately is what's going to make us smart. Remember, the more we know, the more effectively that we can do things. This brings me to one last point, which is that in the modern world, one of the things that we hear about a lot is multitasking. We believe that effective work environments are ones in which people are doing 4 or 5 or 6 things at once. Well, the fact is that human beings don't really multitask. What we do is we share our time across a variety of different tasks that we're doing. So if you're trying to answer your email while writing a paper, while reading something, all at the same time, you're not really doing those all at the same time. You're shifting your attention back and forth from one thing to the next to the next. And every time that you shift from one to the next, you're also losing a little bit of time because you have to get your head into the context of the email you were writing or the document you were writing or something else that you were learning about. So rather than multitasking, you really ought to put yourself in a place where you can do one thing at a time. And that is one of the key ways of developing high quality knowledge. Now, remember, one of the key things about learning is to summarize. So let's do this again. What is high quality knowledge? High quality knowledge is causal knowledge. It's the knowledge that you use to answer the question why. And even though human beings love to ask the question why and answer the question why, the quality of our knowledge is often not as good as we think it is. That's the illusion of explanatory depth. And the way that you cure the illusion of explanatory depth is by teaching things to yourself. Because the more effectively that you teach things to yourself, the better you are at finding gaps in your knowledge and finding words that you thought you understood that you don't really understand. And if you develop high quality knowledge, that will ultimately enable you to answer questions and to solve problems that you never thought that you were going to have to solve in the first place. The third aspect of the formula for smart thinking is applying the knowledge that you have when you need it. Now, that means that somewhere in your head, you must know something that's going to help you to deal with a new situation, and you have to find it. Now, most of the time, that's really easy. When you bring your car to get fixed to the mechanic has seen hundreds of cars before, and chances are the mechanic hears the whine that your engine is making and immediately has the idea that there's a particular belt in the car that needs to be replaced. And that knowledge comes partly from understanding the way the car works, but partly from the experience of seeing many, many, many different engines before and knowing that this is just another engine that's going to have similar kinds of problems. And if you think about it, that's the way that we get through most of our lives most of the time. Whether you're trying to cook something in the kitchen or solve a new math problem or find your way home from work or even solve a problem at work, chances are most of the time what you do is find some situation that you were in that's similar to the one that you're in right now and use the knowledge from that situation to help you to solve the new problem. The real interesting part about smart thinking comes from the cases where you initially believe that you're stuck. Being stuck in a problem-solving situation is one of the worst feelings that you can have because that's where this intense frustration fits in. You're trying to solve this problem, and your initial belief is that you don't know anything that's going to be able to help you to solve the problem. Well, what are the possibilities in that situation? One possibility is you really don't know anything that's going to help you to solve the problem. Well, in that case, you're stuck. In that case, you'd better go ask somebody else and hope that they know the answer to the problem. That's what I do when my car breaks down. I don't know the answer, I know I don't know the answer, and I know that there's somebody else who does. Now, sometimes we're in a situation in which not only don't we know the answer, it turns out nobody knows the answer. So if you think, for example, about trying to develop an LED television, one of the key problems that had to be solved in developing an LED television was that they had to be able to create blue LEDs. So it turned out it was fairly easy to create red ones, it was fairly easy to create green ones, and they had those for many years, but it took a long time to figure out how to generate blue from an LED. That was a case where nobody knew the answer, and it required research and development in order to be able to do it. And that's a second way of trying to develop new knowledge. But again, that's a case where nobody knows the answer. Both of those kinds of things are very expensive. If you don't know the answer and someone else does, you end up having to pay them for their knowledge. And if nobody in the world knows the answer, research and development is very expensive. So what you have to hope is that in fact you really do know the knowledge that you need to solve a problem, only it comes from a different area of your knowledge that doesn't seem similar on the surface to the problem you're trying to solve. This was the situation that James Dyson was in with the vacuum cleaner. What Dyson did was he looked at the vacuum and he didn't say, what do I know about bags or what do I know about vacuums? Because neither of those things were going to help him to solve the problem. Instead, he asked, what do I know about separating dirt from air? And by thinking about the problem more broadly, thinking about separating rather than making a better bag or creating a better vacuum, he was able to think about other things that he knew about that were like the vacuum in some key way, but weren't really vacuum cleaners. That's called using analogy. Analogies are things that are similar at this kind of deep level, similar at the level of the causal knowledge about them, but not really similar on the surface. Sawmills don't look at all like vacuum cleaners, but they are like them in the sense that both of them need to be able to separate air and some kind of particle that's in the air. And then Dyson was able to adapt the solution from sawmills and bring it into vacuum cleaners. And that was a critical part of what allowed him to do smart thinking in the case of developing his vacuum cleaner. So analogy is a critical way of being able to take knowledge that you have and to apply it in new situations. So you'd think, okay, I'm all done. Now I know how to be smart. The problem is that often people will have knowledge, but they won't actually be able to pull it out of their heads when they need it. Because we don't usually live in a world of analogy. When I bring my car to the mechanic, I don't want my mechanic to be thinking about all of the other things that might operate somewhat the way that a car engine does. I want my mechanic to use knowledge about the way cars work to fix my car. And if I go to the doctor, I don't want my doctor to treat my blood circulation system as just some kind of hydraulic system that has fluid flowing in it. I want my doctor thinking about my circulation. Most of the time, we want people to be using the knowledge that they have in the domain that they're going to be studying it. And so as a result, we're not really in the habit of using analogies. If we want to be able to use analogies, we have to discover the essence of a problem. Now, what do I mean by the essence of a problem? In order to think about the essence, I want you to think about proverbs. Every culture has these wonderful proverbs that distill a key wisdom from that culture into a single sentence. So for example, if I give you the proverb that the noise of the wheels does not measure the load in the wagon, well, on the surface, that is a proverb that's about wheels and wagons. But it's not really about wheels and wagons. It's really about a deeper idea, the idea that the surface properties of something, the noise of the wheels, doesn't measure, is not a good indication of its deeper or more essential properties. That's the load in the wagon. And that's sort of like having the noise of the wheels doesn't measure the load in the wagon really means that the surface properties of something don't necessarily reflect the inner essence of it. And that's what I mean by trying to find the essence of a problem. Whenever you get to a problem, ask yourself, if this problem were a proverb, what would it be? What would it really be like? So this is a crucial part of using the knowledge that you need when you need it, is that you need to find ways of describing problems in effective ways. Ultimately, the effective use of knowledge requires finding ways of making sure that you use your memory effectively. And what that means is that you have to create situations that will make the problem that you're trying to solve more like the situation that you were in when you learned the information in the first place. And that means that if you want to become better at learning, at using analogies, one of the things that you need to do is, in the process of learning information, you actually need to spend some time thinking about those essences, thinking about what it is you're really learning about, even at the time that you're doing the learning in the first place. Because the more that you think about what is it that this new device is really doing, what is it that this situation is really about, the more that you think about that at the time that you learn it, the better you're going to be later when you see some new situation at being able to recognize that this situation you were in before is like this new situation in some critical way. And so both at the time that you're learning and at the time that you're trying to use your knowledge, one of the things that you want to do is to get in the habit of finding this essence, of finding the depth that's inside of the proverbs that are part of the daily life that we lead. Because the more that you're able to do that, the better able you are to take some piece of knowledge, some piece of high quality knowledge that you picked up somewhere along the way in your life, and to be able to translate that and use it in a new situation. And that, when you put it all together, is really the core of smart thinking. So, once again, let's summarize where we've been. In order to be able to use knowledge, you have to be able to take something that you know and apply it in a new situation. And of course, usually that's an easy thing to do because the new situation is very similar to something you encountered before. The difficulty comes when the new situation doesn't have anything that's directly similar to it. And so what you really need to do is to find something that is analogous to it, because the analogy is the thing that shares only these causal properties. And so what you want to do in order to be able to use an analogy is to find the essence of the problem you're trying to solve. Every problem is like a proverb. It has some deep essential part to it, and what you're trying to do is to describe that essential part in order to be able to draw out your knowledge from the past. And if you understand that, then you can begin to get in a habit, even when you're learning, of finding those essences and using them as part of the learning process, and that will make you more effective at being able to use your knowledge when you need it. Now, it's one thing for me to try to give you a formula for smart thinking, but this is a very general kind of a formula. Ultimately, if you're going to use this, you have to find a way to be able to put it into practice in specific situations that you encounter. So what can you do really specifically in the world the way it is to become smarter? I'll give you a few things here. The rest will be saved for reading the book. One of them is, imagine situations in which you have to attend a meeting or perhaps you have to present something in a meeting. In each of those cases, it's really crucial to remember that when people are learning new things, that they are likely to remember primarily three things about the situation that they encounter. What does that mean? It means that when you are in a meeting, you should make sure that you figure out which three things it is that you want to remember about that situation you were in. Now, many times we go to meetings and the meeting runs a few minutes over and you've got another appointment to get to and you're sure that 20 emails came in while you were sitting in the meeting. And so what do? You leap out of your chair at the end of the meeting, you pull out your smartphone and you start checking your email. The problem with doing that is that while you may actually answer a couple of emails that came in, you're now leaving your memory for that situation completely up to chance. What you need to do instead is to spend a minute summarizing the three key points of the meeting before you move on to the next thing. And that helps to solidify the knowledge that you pull out of that situation. It also means that if you are in the situation of having to present information to people, don't try to present every single thing you know to people all at once, because they're only going to remember approximately three things. So instead, make sure that you focus each of your presentations on roughly three things that you want people to learn. And if you remember this role of three, then you will not only make yourself smarter, you'll also begin to help make everybody else around you smarter. So that's one thing that you can do. A second thing that you need to do is to make sure that when you sit down to solve a problem, that you try to solve a problem that is specific enough to actually be solved. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to give a talk to a very large company. And in that meeting, one of the vice presidents of the company spoke before I did, and this vice president talked about how important it was going to be in the coming year to streamline business practices because the company had to learn to do more with less. Well, everyone else around me kept saying, yes, this is wonderful, we have to streamline. And then they got together in some work groups and they had to figure out how to streamline. And as they sat around, they realized nobody was really sure what the word streamline really meant when it came to business practices. Because after all, the word streamline really comes from aeronautics. And what it means is that you're trying to reduce the forces of drag on something that's flying through the air or through the water. Well, what that really means is you're trying to make it more efficient. And so really what the vice president was telling them was they had to make the business more efficient by making it more efficient. Well, that really isn't a very helpful way of trying to solve a problem. And so the group, after their initial enthusiasm, really had to sit down and figure out what exactly was the problem that needed to be solved. And then they could set about trying to figure out how to solve it. So those are two things that you can begin to do to take these kinds of principles and put them into practice. The first is to recognize the importance of the role of three in your life. That is, you are going to learn and remember about three things from any situation that you encounter. So make sure that you control the things that you want to remember about situations, and make sure that when you're presenting information to other people, that you make sure that they remember the three things that they're supposed to remember. And second, when you're in a situation in which you actually have to bring your knowledge to bear to solve a new problem, make sure that you set that problem up in a way that is specific enough that the problem can actually be solved and not have essentially an illusion of explanatory depth for the problem itself. Now, I've focused so far primarily on how it is that you can make yourself smarter. And of course, that's a great goal. But the fact is that the more that you know about the way that your mind works, the more that you can also help to make everybody else around you smarter as well. And because we live in a world in which our success often depends on everyone being able to pull together in order to be able to achieve things that no single person alone could do, it's important to make sure that an entire organization is filled with really smart people. So what can we do to create this culture of smart? The first thing that we can do is to encourage everyone to learn more about the way that they think. You would never have a whole shop full of mechanics, only one of whom understood the way the machinery worked. You would really want everyone to be expert in that machinery. Well, if you have an organization filled with people who are trying to think for a living, it stands to reason that all of them should begin to understand the way that their minds work to make sure that they are all able to use that knowledge about thinking in order to be able to develop smarter thinking habits. So that's the first thing. The second thing that every organization needs to do is to be open to new ideas. I've had the chance to speak to a number of different companies over the years. Some of them are filled with people who are just curious. They want to understand how everything works, even if the idea wasn't their own. But I've also had the chance to speak with other companies filled with people who are really interested primarily in ideas that were developed within that company. And they aren't so interested in things that happened elsewhere, and they aren't so interested in things where they're not sure how they're going to be able to use that knowledge sometime later. Now, it is true that different people may differ in how open they are to ideas, but at the same time, organizations can promote a culture of being open to ideas. If the people at the top of a group spend their time being interested in things and showing other people that they're interested in ideas, then that really sends the message to everyone that you never know where the next good idea is going to come from. And so you need to make sure that everyone thinks about where it is that they're going to learn new things. And finally, it's crucial for the success of any organization to make sure that we recognize that individual achievement is not really the ultimate road to success for an organization. Every organization really has to have a group of people working together. One of the things that I do is I play music. And I sometimes play just standing in a studio in my house all alone, but most of the time I get together with other people. Now, if we want to make beautiful music, what we have to do is all play together well and not have individual people who are playing well and everyone doing something different. And so what that means is that we need to get in the habit, so this is another one of our smart habits, we need to develop the smart habit of making sure that everyone feels included in the success of the organization and that everyone wants to engage in smart thinking because it is the success of the group that ultimately determines whether we're going to be successful as an organization and not the success of any particular individual. And those are some of the ways that you can really develop a culture of smart thinking. So you want to encourage everyone to think about thinking and to learn about thinking. You want to make sure that everyone engages with this process, and you ultimately want to make sure that individuals don't stand alone within organizations, but that really people within the organization share their knowledge and work together and share ideas in order to create a success. Because if people work together, then you end up with an organization whose knowledge is really greater than the sum of the knowledge of all of the individual people. So to review first, we've gone over a number of different things. And really it all centers on our formula for smart thinking. Remember, smart thinking isn't about being intelligent. It's really about developing smart habits, using those smart habits to acquire high-quality knowledge, and then finding strategies for being able to use that knowledge when you need it. Now, the critical part about smart thinking is that as human beings, all of us are thinking creatures. What we do is think all the time. We don't just think at work, or we don't just think in particular situations. We're actually thinking all the time. Now, one of the reasons that this matters is that even if you believe that the most important thing in your life is what you do at work, and I'm not sure that I recommend that, but even if that is what you believe, you never know where it is that the knowledge that's going to be important to you is going to come from. It could be a visit to a sawmill. It could be a conversation that you have with your children when they're asking that question, why? It could be something that you discover while you're driving along one day, or something that you read in a book, or something that you see on television. So these principles need to be a part of your life entirely. And more importantly, because most of us don't think that the only important things are the things that we do at work, using these principles of smart thinking throughout our lives is the sort of thing that's really going to allow us to lead a life that is fulfilling in all of its pieces, at work, at home with our families, and when we're doing the things that we enjoy for fun. In this way, we can really bring together all of the pieces of our life using a single formula for smart thinking.